At Third Space Charity, we support a mentally resilient community by offering accessible counseling care to young adults between the ages of 18 and 29. This is Mental Health Matters, where we discuss topics and services related to mental health and wellness in our community.
Welcome to Mental Health Matters. My guest today is Carmen Rempel of the Kelowna Gospel Mission. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Megan.
Thank you for coming today. Start off by telling us a little bit about how you ended up in your role at the Kelowna Gospel Mission.
Sure. So I spent my entire career in the charitable sector. Previously, I was working with high-risk teenagers. And as a part of that journey, I became the adoptive mother of 3 teenagers. And it was because of my kids that I ended up at the Gospel Mission. So I was talking to them. I had been approached by the company who were looking for a new executive director for the Gospel Mission, as the previous one was retiring. And when I got the phone call, I thought, wow, this is a big job. And I talked to my kids about it. And all of them have parents who have either experienced homelessness, addiction, mental health challenges, to the degree that made them unable to parent their kids, which is why they ended up in our home. And so when I was talking to one of my daughters about it, I was telling her about our recovery homes at the mission, and about the shelters, and about all the various things that she did, and she was 12 at the time. And I was explaining to her, if I take this job, it means that I won't be around quite as much, it's going to be a big job. It will require a lot of me, so this should be a family decision. And so she went away and she thought about it, and she came back the next day, and she was like, those recovery homes. She's like, could my mom go there? I said, oh, kiddo, they're exactly for people like your mom who have troubles like your mom has. And she goes, okay, then I think that it's really important work that they do there. And I think that you would do well at it. So I think that you have to do it, actually.
How profound.
I know.
For a 12-year-old.
She's a deep kid. She's
Wow.
a deep kid.
Wow.
Yeah, so that little conversation with her changed my life.
I bet. How old is she now?
She's 16.
Okay, so you've been in the role for 4 years. I'm doing the math.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, coming up on 4 years. I'll tell you, it feels like 4 decades.
I bet. I bet. There's so much that goes on there. If you were to give the viewers who don't know or are not familiar with the Kelowna Gospel Mission, if you were to give us, a high-level Coles Notes, how would you describe the organization?
Sure. So we're a nonprofit that works in the homelessness serving sector. So our mission is to feed, shelter, and care for people experiencing homelessness. So we do this by meeting them where they're at and providing our 3 things: safety, belonging, and hope. And how those 3 core things present in those different areas where we meet people will create a different program. So in the homelessness serving sector, we talk about a continuum of care. So in that continuum, there's different models and ways of thinking of it. But when we think of it as sort of a linear journey, which is a falsehood in of itself that we may talk about. But if we were to think about it as a linear journey, we think about people who are at the very bottom of the continuum. So these are people who are the most vulnerable, have the highest need. They're actively sleeping outside. So they might be at the outdoor sheltering site, or they might be sleeping in an alcove of a business, but those are at the very bottom of the continuum. So from there, we have people who are in shelters, and then we have transitional housing and supportive housing and permanent housing. So the Gospel Mission occupies every space along that continuum. So for those who are at the very bottom, who are sleeping outside, we have our outreach team. So our outreach team is this extraordinary group of people who they're like the SWAT team of the Kelowna Gospel Mission. They're like our search and rescue. So they get in the vehicles out at 6:30 in the morning and they hit the streets of Kelowna. And they go equipped with basic necessities that people need to survive. So food, clothing, sleeping bags, tents, first aid supplies. Sometimes they travel with a nurse with them in that partnership with the health authority. Sometimes they'll travel with a social worker with them. And so they do mobile case management. So anyway, they go out first thing in the morning and they meet with people. They provide for their basic needs because that sandwich, that cup of coffee, that really is the conduit for a relationship. So we're meeting their needs, building relationships, and then from there, then the work is to triage people into whatever the next best step is for them. So often it's our outreach team who are taking people and triaging them into our shelters. So we've got 2 shelters at the Gospel Mission. One is a higher barrier shelter. It's for people who are working on their sobriety. So people who either don't have substance use challenges or are trying to manage them, and they need a place where that isn't happening out in the open all the time. And then we have our lower barrier shelter, which is where we have substance use that's being supported. So people who are in active addiction and trying to get a handle on it, we allow them to do it in a safe, supervised way while providing all sorts of wraparound supports. So both of our shelters, we have counseling available, we have life skills workshops, we've got intensive case management where we're working with people on whatever their goals are, and so that they can move up and out. Next, we have our transitional housing. So we've got transitional housing for men and women. And that's where they're getting more intensive case management. They've got more privacy than if you're staying in a shelter. So you've got your own room, and often that comes with either volunteer experience or employment experience that we add to sort of the requirements for them. And then we've got our long-term sort of therapeutic communities, supportive housing for women. We don't have that for men yet, but we have 2 beautiful homes for women, and they're actually filled with seniors right now. And so many of those seniors who are in our women's homes may have started on the street, been triaged into shelter, and then been supported through our transitional housing, and are now living in our therapeutic communities and thriving. So,
wow.
Yeah, that's sort of the scope. We also have a dental clinic at the Gospel Mission.
Yes.
Which is sort of the odd branch off the side of the family tree of all of our services. But it's a beautiful essential service where we are taking people from extreme pain and lots of shame and lots of issues around self-worth and dignity as well. And we're taking them, and by the time they leave, they're pain-free, and it can change their lives. So,
wow.
So that's sort of what we do at the mission in a nutshell.
That's a big job.
It's a big team. We've got everyone on the payroll from, our dentist, to our case managers, to our outreach workers, to our food services personnel who are making 550 meals a day right now that are going out to people in various stages of the continuum. So yeah, it's a happening place. There's lots going on all the time.
Love it. So good. Okay, well, we know that there is stigma attached to homelessness, just like there is to mental health. We combat that in our organization at Third Space Charity. I'd love to hear what Carmen Rempel would say to someone who's in the get a job camp.
Right.
Quit sleeping on the street, quit being lazy, go get a job. What does Carmen say?
Yeah, so thanks for letting me just react to that, because it is something that we hear. There is this uninformed understanding that people wind up homeless because of laziness or poor decision making. And I'm not going to say that's not always the case, but it is. I have never met somebody who ends up homeless for such a simple reason as that. So we talk about homelessness actually exists at the intersection of 2 things: financial poverty and social poverty. So, for example, if I were to tomorrow lose all of my income instantly, lose my house, okay, I will be financially poor. There's no way I'm walking through the door of a shelter or sleeping in the alcove of a business that night, because I could pull out my phone, and on my phone I probably have 50 people that I would feel absolutely comfortable calling them up and saying, hey, something devastating has happened, I need a place to stay. And they would happily open their home to me. I know that because I'm not socially poor. So the reason why we saw this in the fires here in Kelowna in the summertime, is there was a group lodging site for people who were displaced from their home. But there was not everybody who was displaced from their home needed to use it, because many people had friends or family that they could go and stay with. The ones who ended up at that group lodging site are those who didn't have the social network to be able to fall back on. Right? So we see the same thing with homelessness. We see when hard financial times come, those who actually end up homeless are the ones that don't have a social network. So it brings the question, why don't they have that social network to fall back on? We find people who are incredibly isolated end up homeless. So they might be isolated for different reasons. So they might be isolated because they have a substance use challenge that has caused behaviors that has burned relationships. Maybe they have a mental illness that's unmanaged and that has burned relationships. Maybe they're a newcomer to Canada and they don't have any friends. Maybe they are a widower who is a senior citizen and their wife had held the social calendar and they actually don't have any friends themselves and their wife is now gone. And as soon as they fall on hard times, they actually don't have. So that's a growing population that we're finding coming into our shelters is lonely senior citizens who no longer can afford to live in our city. So when people say, go and get a job, there are so many more complex reasons for why people end up homeless in the first place. And so because of the complexity of those reasons, the journey out is just as differentiated. So each person winds up in that desperate place through a different journey, and their journey out is also going to be different. But you have to be addressing those root causes of what caused them to be isolated in the first place. So for some, that's going to be their mental health. You're not going to be able to keep a job if you keep having voices telling you that you have bugs under your skin, right? Or to go jump off something, or that you're being watched, right? Really hard to keep a job when you feel paranoia, or if you have OCD tendencies, can make it very difficult to keep a job. So often the first step before you can get a job is managing your mental illness, if that's what brought you there in the first place. Or it's repairing old relationships, or it's getting your substance use under control first. So I think it's interesting, there was a survey of people experiencing homelessness in Kelowna, within the past year. And one of the questions they asked is, what's your top priority, or what do you need? And one of the top 3 things that people named is they wanted a job.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it surprised a lot of people that there is a willingness to work, but the barriers between people and the ability to work are high, right? Getting a handle on substance use is super challenging, and that can be a lifelong journey for people. Getting a handle on mental illness, that is a tough job. So there's a lot of things that have to happen before somebody can get a job. Not to mention access to clean clothes, access to a place to shower are key. It's really hard to keep a job when you're living in your car and you can't wash your clothes after a day. So those are just some of the things that I would say to people who say, people experiencing homelessness should just get a job. It's like, whoa, you have no idea how difficult that actually is.
That brings up the new initiative in Kelowna that I wanted to ask you about. Now I know that Kelowna Gospel Mission doesn't oversee the tiny homes transitional project.
Yep.
But you very much will have synergies with that. And so can you tell us a little bit about the impact that the tiny home transitional project will have on Kelowna Gospel Mission?
Yeah, for sure. So there's some really interesting things happening in our sector right now. So if we're looking at, so there's 120 units that are going to be opening in the next few months, right,
Yes.
for people. So we talked before about the continuum of care. So the question for our sector was, so we're going to have these 120 new units, where in the continuum will they be placed?
Right.
So originally there was actually a very problematic misunderstanding. People thought, people experiencing homelessness, living on the street, were under the impression that if they were staying at the outdoor sheltering site, which is the city designated spot over on Crowley Ave, there's this misunderstanding that if people were staying here, they were going to prop up these tiny homes and they were going to be able to just move right in. Right? So if you were at the site, we're going to give you a home, was the misunderstanding, which is actually very disappointing when people found out how we're actually approaching it. So what's going to be happening is people who are in the shelters right now, who have they are being triaged into those transitional housing. So as opposed to being at the very bottom of the continuum, it's actually after the shelters. So people can go from sheltering outside into the shelters, and from the shelters into the transitional housing place. And then from there onward into whatever is the best fit for them, whether that's affordable housing, supportive housing, market housing, whatever it is that they need, they can move on to. But that's where we find the actual bottleneck in this whole continuum, where we don't see any flow. The idea is that there's supposed to be a flow through, but there's this bottleneck that starts all the way with attainable housing, which we have. So what's happened, if I may, what's happened is the cost of affording a home is so challenging. There's so many barriers for that, that people who normally would be purchasing homes are renting, and so there's less rental supply. So people who are in supportive housing or affordable housing, who usually would be moving up into to rental housing, there's no supply, and so they're staying where they are. So our supportive housing, once people move in, they don't leave again until they die, right? Like they're in there forever, as opposed to moving on into affordable or rental housing and whatnot.
Does supportive come before affordable? What's the difference between supportive housing and affordable housing?
Great question. So supportive housing comes with extra supports. So there might be meals provided. You're going to be paying something like $375 a month, thereabouts. Don't quote me on that. there's a small program participant fee, which provides you with meals. There's personnel on site, right? 24 hours a day. There's usually in town, most of our supportive housing units have an overdose prevention site there that's monitored, right? They're going to have things like, if somebody struggles with keeping their room clean, there's going to be supports with people who have hoarding tendencies, right? So actually home support that can come in and help people stay housed. And they're really, really good at helping people stay housed. Affordable housing is just what it sounds like. So you don't have staff there 24/7. It really is just some affordable housing has sliding scale geared to income, some is a subsidy, whatnot, but it is just a more economical rental unit than you're going to find in market housing.
And it would typically be, I've heard the number thrown around 30% of your wage is what is a responsible, ethical thing to be paying for rent.
I think it's the ideal. I think it's the ideal.
It would be around 30% of what you're bringing in should be going to your rent. So the affordable housing units do a means test and then assess what you're making and then adjust your rent accordingly.
That would be great. No. So the way that, and it depends. So different. There's going to be different models set up for different units. So I can't speak to all of the different ones we have in Kelowna because there are different models. But one that is very common is it just has to be 75% of market value. Which is often for people still far more than 30% of their income. So we run into this issue where if a unit is 75% of market value, but that's still 50% of someone's income, is it really affordable housing? So that's, So you can see how, the bottleneck that happens here with what's going on with people being able to afford to purchase homes is this bottleneck that compresses all the way down to people sleeping in alcoves. Which is why we concern ourselves with public policy when it comes to home building, right? Rental Tenancy Act, all those different things. It all applies when we're talking about homelessness because it has this trickle down effect.
a question that popped up for me when you were explaining where the tiny homes go in the continuum, and you
Yeah.
were saying it's actually the individuals that are sheltered. They're moving into the transitional.
Correct.
And so are the shelters overflowing, like full, and that's
Yes.
why we have
Yeah.
the tent, sorry, what is that called?
Yeah, the outdoor sheltering
The outdoor
site.
shelter.
Yes.
So it's because these people can't physically get into, it's not because they're choosing not to.
Sure. So both and. So we
Okay.
have an outdoor sheltering site in Kelowna because municipalities are mandated to provide a designated spot where people can camp if there aren't enough shelter spaces available for them.
Gotcha.
Right. So we do not have enough shelter spaces. We're turning people away at our door every single day
Okay.
because the shelters are full. So because the shelters are full, the city has to have this encampment spot. So they've provided it, it's managed. It's actually, they do a phenomenal job. Like, especially comparing to other municipalities across our province, we do a really good job in Kelowna. So what was the question again? We were talking about.
Oh, I was just wondering if, so basically it will impact the whole
Yes.
continuum, because the people who are on those sites are now going to move into the shelter.
Correct. So what that creates is openings in the shelter for people to come in. So we do have this challenge, however, and that challenge is there's some folks who are currently living outside who are there because they've had a denial of service at our shelters. So it could be because of violence.
Right.
Could be because of behavioral, challenges. But something has happened to get them barred from every shelter in town.
Okay.
So there is this small minority of those folks that are really outside of our whole sheltering system that our challenge now is, what do we do for those folks? And so there's kind of two categories. There's those who have such severe behavioral challenges that make them unable to live in shelter safely. And then there's another group of people whose actual physical health needs are so great that make them inappropriate for shelter. So, for example, with our aging population, we have people who have, they're in heart failure. They have, they have to use mobility devices to get around and have a colostomy bag. Maybe they're in early stages of dementia as well. Like, we have folks who have very, very severe physical health challenges that make them actually unsuitable for the shelter setting, because our shelters don't have nurses. We don't have
Yes.
care aides. We're not an assisted living facility. We're not a hospital. And these folks really require that other level of care that simply we can't provide in shelters. And so the question is, where do they go?
And a long-term care home wouldn't accept them?
I believe they also have a capacity challenge. Honestly, I don't know. There's this whole group of people that are inappropriate for shelters, and because we don't have the capacity to care for them well. But being out on the street is not the answer. Yeah, so we need really more. It's almost a shelter with increased health supports to be available.
Almost like a hospital, kind of.
Yeah, kind of like a hospital outpatient unit. Yeah, sure. If we're talking about the continuum and where there's gaps, it's recognized that one of those gaps is some sort of space where people who are transitioning out of hospital, because we have quite a few folks who frequent the hospital who will get discharged from the hospital and they'll come into shelters, and often it's before they're ready. And they need that increased level of health supports. So the question is, could there be an alternative site where people can go when they're discharged from hospital that isn't the shelter, but is sort of like a transitional dorm that has increased health supports in it before they come back into shelter? I mean, ideally they wouldn't have to come to shelter at all, but hence all of our issues around supply. So.
Such an enlightening conversation today. I think that this is what a lot of people need to be educated on, to know just all the intricacies of how it all comes together and how it works. How do you stay well in your role?
Great question. You know, it's funny. Thank you for asking that, because I know you focus about mental health, and one of the challenges in doing this work. So I talked about our shelters being full. Mm-hmm. So I want you to imagine for just a moment the young, recently graduated with their social work certificate employee who comes to work at the Gospel Mission because they want to, because you want to change lives, right? Yeah. And you're going to make a difference. Yeah. And you have all this hope. I know. and then you show up, and on your first shift, you're there to care for the vulnerable. And on your first shift, the first thing you have to do is stand there at the door when somebody is standing there cold, scared, hungry, and you have to look them in the eye and say, sorry, we're full. You can't stay. And you have to watch them walk away. Yeah. That creates that's actually morally injurious. Mm-hmm. So we talk about post-traumatic stress. We also talk about accumulative trauma, secondhand trauma, and then this new thing that we keep talking about is moral injury. And moral injury is anytime you have to behave in a way that's in conflict with your ethics or values. And I think that actually being in this work, we're forced to live in contradiction with our ethics and values every day because of because of how big the need is and our lack of capacity to meet it. And so we do severe damage to people who come and participate in this work. And we have to take a lot of care. We have to take a lot of care, managing expectations, holding each other, creating safe spaces. We've got a spiritual care director, who's a director at the Gospel Mission, and his role is to follow up after every critical incident report with the staff who are involved. If somebody has, it's monitored monthly. If you had to give a loss of access or a denial of service, or if you had to turn several people away, you're going to get a checkup. Good. Yeah, from our guy who's going to come around and just check in on you and see how you're doing. Good. So those are some of the things that we've put in place for our staff to try to care for their mental health, because this work is super tough. It is. Yeah. And then for me, I just go camping by myself. You ride your motorcycle. And I ride my motorcycle. Yes. And I go running and get alone where I'm not responsible for anybody but myself. Yes. That's so good. That's where peace exists for me. So if people want to learn more, or they want to donate or support the Kelowna Gospel Mission, how do they do that? Where do they go? We love their support. So what we love is unrestricted, undesignated funds. Yes, please. Yes, please. That's right. Because later we can talk about the tyranny of grants. Oh my goodness. Grant writing. And project-based, one-time only funding is pretty much useless. So I know. Unless you want to buy a physical thing. So anyway. When people donate unrestricted funds, that way we can use it to actually meet the needs of people as they emerge. You can use the funds for what you feel the need is, and you are the experts. Yeah, we can be strategic, right? We can actually be strategic in the way that we're addressing needs instead of the tail wagging the dog, right? Yes. So KelownaGospelMission.ca, click on donate, give generously, and we'll make sure they're stewarded really well so that we can actually be making an impact on people's lives where they need it. Thank you for everything that you do for this community. Thank you for coming and talking to us today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next month.